I heard my son laugh before I ever saw his face. And in that moment, standing outside those closed doors, I realized the world had learned how to celebrate without me. The sound drifted through the walls like warm light slipping under a door. Music swelled, hands clapped, glasses chimed. Someone inside was telling a joke, and the laughter that followed was full-bodied and unrestrained, the kind of joy that only comes when everyone you love is gathered in one place. I stood there, with my purse clutched too tight against my ribs, my shoes pinching my toes, my heart thudding so loud I was certain someone would hear it and open the door out of pity. But no one did. I was late to my son's wedding. Not fashionably late, not swept in by the wind late. I was the kind of late that sits heavy in your chest and rewrites your memories before you've even stepped inside. The kind of late that makes you question how a life of devotion can still leave you on the outside, listening. I pressed my palm against the cool wooden door and closed my eyes. The smell of flowers, lilies, I think, mixed with polished floor cleaner seeped through the crack. Somewhere inside, a woman gasped happily. Somewhere inside, my son was beginning a life I would always be a few steps behind. And I wondered, with a quiet shame I had carried most of my adult life, how I had ended up here. Before the wedding, before the white dress and the music and the carefully folded programs, my life had been small and steady. That was how I liked it. I woke up early, usually before the sun had fully decided what kind of day it wanted to be. The kettle was the first thing I reached for. There was comfort in that whistle, in the way the steam fogged up the window above the sink. I lived alone by then, in a narrow house with creaky stairs and a garden I pretended not to neglect. My son, Daniel, used to call every Sunday evening. Even as a grown man, even after he'd moved 2 towns over and started a career that required words I didn't fully understand, he still called. "Just checking in, Mom," he'd say, like I was a habit he hadn't quite broken yet. I'd tell him what I had cooked, usually too much of it, and he'd laugh and say, "You still cooking for an army?" Those calls were the anchors of my week. I'd sit at the small kitchen table, fingers tracing the worn edge, listening to the sounds of his life in the background, a microwave beeping, a door closing, sometimes her voice, Emily. I had met her twice before the wedding. She was polite in that careful way, always smiling but never quite relaxing her shoulders. She called me Mrs. Harris even after I asked her not to, and when she hugged me, her arms barely touched my back. I told myself it was nerves. I told myself young women had a way of guarding themselves these days. I didn't tell myself the truth, that she didn't know where I fit into her picture of the future. Daniel assured me everything was fine. "She's just shy," he said once, his voice distracted as if he were already halfway into another conversation. "You'll see once you get to know her." I wanted to believe him. I had always wanted to believe my son. Raising Daniel alone had taught me the art of believing in things without proof. His father left when Daniel was 6, 1 suitcase and a note on the counter that said he wasn't built for responsibility. I remember reading it while Daniel slept, the house so quiet it felt like a held breath. I cried then, but only then. By morning, I had folded the note and tucked it into a drawer, the way you do with things you can't afford to look at too often. From that day on, it was just the 2 of us. I worked double shifts at the nursing home, my feet aching and my hands smelling faintly of antiseptic no matter how much I washed them. I learned how to stretch a meal, how to fix a leaky faucet with borrowed tools, how to sit through school assemblies smiling even when my eyes burned from exhaustion. Daniel never knew how close we came some months. I made sure of that. Children shouldn't have to carry their parents' fears. He grew up gentle, thoughtful, the kind of boy who held doors open and noticed when you were tired. On nights when I came home late, he'd leave a plate in the oven with a note written in careful block letters. I made spaghetti. Don't forget to eat. Those memories played in my mind as I stood outside that wedding hall, listening to a new chapter begin without me. The day itself had unraveled slowly, like a thread pulled from an old sweater. I woke up before my alarm, heart already racing. My dress hung from the closet door, navy blue and pressed the night before. I had set everything out, shoes, jewelry, the small envelope with a check tucked inside. I was ready. But life has a way of reminding you that readiness is not the same as control. The bus was late. Then the traffic stalled. My phone buzzed with a message from a neighbor asking if I could come by. Just for a moment, she said. Her husband had fallen again. I told myself I'd be quick. I always told myself that. By the time I left her apartment, hands still trembling from lifting a body that wasn't mine to carry, the sky had shifted colors. I checked the time and felt something cold settle in my stomach. I called Daniel, but it went to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. What would I have said? I'm trying. I always am. Now I stood there, late, invisible, listening to joy echo where I was not. I smoothed my dress, took a breath that didn't quite reach my lungs, and reached for the door. Somewhere inside, my son was smiling, and I was about to find out what that smile cost me. I didn't open the door right away. Instead, I stood there long enough for my reflection to settle in the narrow glass panel beside it. I barely recognized the woman staring back. Her hair was pinned neatly, but a few strands had escaped and clung to her temple with sweat. Her lipstick was still intact, but her eyes, those told the truth. They looked like someone who had spent a lifetime holding things together with careful hands and had finally arrived at the one place where her grip loosened. I straightened my shoulders. I had learned how to do that long ago. At parent-teacher conferences, when other children's fathers filled the seats, at weddings where I attended alone, smiling politely at couples who didn't know what to do with a single woman my age, at funerals where grief felt too heavy to share, I had learned how to walk into rooms carrying pain like it was nothing more than a handbag. So I opened the door. The music swelled instantly, louder than I expected, wrapping around me in a rush of sound and warmth. Everyone was standing. I caught glimpses of backs and shoulders, dark suits and pastel dresses. The air was thick with perfume and flowers and something sweet, champagne maybe. For a moment, no one noticed me. I was just another late guest slipping in quietly. And then I saw him. Daniel stood at the front, taller than I remembered somehow, his suit fitting him like it had been made for this moment alone. He was smiling, wide and unguarded, the kind of smile that pulls at your chest because you remember when it had been gummy and crooked and missing teeth. He was looking at Emily like she was the only person left in the world. I felt pride first, sharp and sudden. That was my son, the boy I had rocked to sleep through fevers, the teenager who had pretended not to care when I embarrassed him in front of his friends, the man who now stood ready to promise his life to someone else. Then I felt the space beside him, an empty chair in the front row, draped with a pale ribbon. My place. My legs trembled. I moved slowly down the aisle, conscious of every step, every soft scuff of my shoe against the floor. A few heads turned. Someone whispered. I heard my name, or maybe I imagined it. By the time I reached the end of the row, the officiant had already begun speaking again, his voice steady, practiced, forgiving nothing. There was no pause for me, no glance from Daniel. He didn't see me, or maybe he did and he chose not to let the moment break. I would later tell myself that was a kindness. I slipped into the chair and folded my hands in my lap. My fingers were cold. I watched the ceremony like someone watching a scene through glass, close enough to see every detail, too far away to touch any of it. Emily's dress shimmered softly under the lights. She dabbed at her eyes once, smiling through tears. Daniel squeezed her hands, murmuring something that made her laugh. Their joy filled the room. It was undeniable. It was complete. And it had begun without me. As the vows were exchanged, my mind wandered backward, pulled by memories I hadn't invited. I remembered the night Daniel told me he was getting married. We were on the phone, as usual. He sounded nervous, like he was about to ask for permission, even though he no longer needed it. "Mom," he said, clearing his throat, "Emily and we set a date." I had smiled so hard my cheeks hurt. I told him how happy I was, how proud. I asked questions: where, when, who was coming. He answered them all, but there was a pause when I asked about my role. It was grief, almost imperceptible, but it lodged itself in my chest. "Well," he said slowly, "it's going to be small, simple. Emily's been planning most of it." I told him I understood. I always understood. Weeks passed. Invitations were sent. Mine arrived last, tucked among bills and grocery flyers. It was beautiful. Cream-colored paper, elegant lettering. No mention of mothers or fathers, just guests. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself love didn't need titles. But standing there now, listening to my son promise forever, I felt the weight of every moment I had chosen to step aside so others could shine. Every time I had swallowed my needs because someone else's seemed louder. Every time I had believed quiet sacrifice was enough to earn a place. When the officiant finally pronounced them married, the room erupted, applause thundered, music surged. Daniel kissed Emily and the crowd cheered like they had been holding their breath all along. I clapped too. My hands moved automatically, rhythmically, like they belonged to someone else. Tears slipped down my cheeks, but I didn't wipe them away. I didn't want to disturb the moment. I didn't want to be seen. The reception blurred into a sequence of sounds and colors. I watched from the edges as people hugged and laughed and toasted. I recognized a few faces, cousins I hadn't seen in years, old friends from Daniel's childhood. Some noticed me and waved, surprise flickering across their expressions before they recovered with polite smiles. "Congratulations," they said, as if I were a distant relative. I sat alone at a small table near the back. My name card was there, placed neatly beside a pale rose centerpiece. Someone had thought of me, or maybe it was just habit. As plates were served and glasses refilled, I listened to speeches that painted my son's life in broad, glowing strokes. His best man told stories from college. Emily's sister spoke about love and destiny. There were jokes I didn't understand, references to memories I hadn't shared. When Daniel stood to speak, my heart leapt. I leaned forward, hope flaring despite myself. He thanked everyone, his friends, Emily's parents, the people who had supported them. He spoke about partnership, about choosing each other every day. He did not mention me. I told myself it was an oversight. I told myself speeches are nerve-wracking, that he had so much to remember. I told myself I didn't need public acknowledgement to know my worth. But something inside me cracked anyway. After the speeches, I excused myself and stepped outside. The night air was cool against my flushed skin. I breathed deeply, letting the sounds of the party fade behind me. My hands shook as I reached for my phone. I wasn't sure who I intended to call. There was no one left to reassure me. I thought about all the times I had been late in my life. Late home from work, late to school events, late to myself. I had always believed love would wait, that the people who mattered would understand. Standing there alone, I wondered if that belief had been naive. I was still outside when Daniel found me. "Daniel?" I turned slowly. He looked concerned, his brow furrowed in a way I knew well. He had that look as a child whenever he sensed something was wrong but didn't know how to fix it. "There you are," he said, stepping closer. "I didn't see you come in." I smiled. It was reflexive, automatic. "I was a little late." "I noticed," he said gently. There was no accusation in his voice, only observation. "Are you okay?"
I wanted to tell him everything about the bus, about the neighbor, about the years, about standing outside listening to Joy without me. I wanted to ask him why he hadn't waited, why my place had been so easy to leave empty. Instead, I said, "It's a beautiful wedding." He nodded, glancing back toward the doors. "It is." We stood there in silence, the space between us filled with words we didn't speak. Finally, he reached out and squeezed my hand. "I'm glad you made it," he said. I looked at him then, really looked, at the man he had become, at the life unfolding before him. "I am too," I said softly, though I wasn't sure it was true. From inside, someone called his name. He hesitated just for a moment, then smiled apologetically. "I should get back," he said. "Of course," I replied. As he turned away, I felt a familiar ache settle in my chest, the ache of being needed once, and now only welcomed. I stayed outside a little longer, letting the night hold me. When I finally went back in, the dancing had begun. Lights dimmed, music softened, couples swayed together. I watched my son dance with his wife, their foreheads touching, laughter shared in whispers meant only for each other. And I realized something then, something I had resisted my whole life. Love doesn't always guarantee belonging. Sometimes it simply asks you to let go. I wiped my tears, squared my shoulders once more, and took my seat. The night went on, and so did I. I stayed until the cake was cut. I don't know why that felt important, but it did. Maybe because cake had always meant celebration in our house. Birthdays, graduations, even surviving particularly hard weeks, we marked them with something sweet, something shared. I watched as Daniel and Emily stood together, hands overlapping on the knife, smiling for cameras. The flash went off again and again, freezing moments I would later imagine hanging on walls I might never be invited to stand near. When the first slice was fed, her laughing as frosting smudged the corner of his mouth, the room erupted in cheers. I smiled too, because that is what mothers do. We smile even when our hearts feel like they've been left behind in the parking lot. I left quietly after that. No grand goodbye, no dramatic exit. I hugged a few relatives, murmured polite words, accepted congratulations that felt strangely misplaced. Daniel was on the dance floor when I slipped out, his jacket discarded, his joy uncomplicated. I didn't interrupt it. The drive home was long and dark. Streetlights passed in steady intervals, illuminating the inside of the car just enough to remind me I was alone. I kept the radio off. Silence felt more honest. Every so often, my mind replayed the sound from earlier, the laughter through the door, the applause I hadn't earned a seat for. It followed me like an echo. At home, I kicked off my shoes and sat on the edge of the bed without turning on the light. The dress rustled softly as I folded it over my knees. I thought about hanging it back up, preserving it somehow, but I knew I wouldn't wear it again. Some clothes are only meant for one moment. Sleep didn't come easily. When it finally did, it was shallow, filled with fragments of memory. Daniel as a toddler, tugging at my sleeve. Daniel at 16, slamming a door and apologizing an hour later. Daniel at the altar, smiling into a future that no longer revolved around me. The next morning, my phone buzzed with messages. Photos had already been posted. Daniel and Emily glowing, friends captioning their joy with words like perfect and meant to be. I scrolled longer than I should have, lingering on images where I appeared only as a blur in the background, if at all. A week passed, then another. Daniel called, as he always did on Sundays. His voice was bright, buoyed by newlywed enthusiasm. "We're back from the mini-moan," he said. "Just a few days, but it was great." "I'm glad," I replied, stirring my tea, though it had long since gone cold. There was a pause, not an uncomfortable one, just enough space for something real to slip through. "Mom," he said, "I wanted to say, I'm sorry you were late." The words surprised me.
not because they were hurtful, but because they acknowledged something I had tried hard to minimize. "It's all right," I said automatically. "No," he insisted gently, "it's not. I know you didn't mean to be. I should have checked in. We should have waited." We should have. The phrase hung between us, fragile and heavy. "I didn't want to cause a scene," he continued. "Emily was nervous and everything was already set. But I kept thinking about you. I just didn't know what to do in the moment." I closed my eyes. For the first time since the wedding, the tightness in my chest loosened just a little. "I know," I said, and I did. I knew him. I knew his heart. I knew how easily he carried responsibility, how deeply he feared disappointing anyone. "I hope you know," he added, "that none of that changes what you mean to me." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to hold on to those words and let them mend what had cracked. But another truth had taken root inside me, quieter but persistent. Meaning doesn't always equal presence. After that call, things settled into a new rhythm. Daniel still called. Sometimes Emily joined him on speaker, her voice polite, measured. They were busy, work, plans, friends. I listened more than I spoke. I didn't offer advice unless asked. I didn't assume invitations. I began to notice how much of my life had been shaped around waiting. Waiting for Daniel to come home, waiting for approval, waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for moments that might finally say, "You matter here." So I stopped waiting. I filled my evenings with things I had postponed for years. I joined a book club at the library, surprised by how much I enjoyed hearing other women's stories. I started walking in the mornings, letting the cool air wake parts of me that had been dormant. I volunteered at the community center twice a week, helping children with homework, their questions earnest and unguarded. Life didn't become easier overnight. Some nights were still heavy. Some mornings I woke with the ache of absence pressing against my ribs. But slowly I began to feel grounded in something other than my role as a mother. Then, one afternoon, Daniel showed up at my door unannounced. He looked tired, older somehow. Marriage had already begun to teach him his lessons. "Hi, Mom," he said, smiling uncertainly. I stepped aside without a word, letting him in. He glanced around the house as if seeing it for the first time, the worn furniture, the framed photos, the quiet. "He brought something," he said, holding out a small envelope. Inside was a photograph. Daniel and me, taken years ago at his high school graduation. We were both laughing, caught mid-motion, unposed. On the back, he had written a date and 4 words, "You were always there." My throat tightened. "I should have said something at the wedding," he said quietly. I froze. I didn't realize until later how much it mattered. I looked at him, really looked, and saw not the groom or the man who had moved on, but the boy who once left notes in the oven. "I didn't raise you so you'd stay," I said softly. "I raised you so you'd live." Tears welled in his eyes. He nodded, pulling me into an embrace that felt both familiar and new. That moment didn't erase the pain of being late. It didn't rewrite the sound of joy without me. It softened it. It placed it within a larger story, one where love changes shape, where belonging isn't guaranteed, but connection is still possible if both people reach for it. As he left, I stood in the doorway and watched him walk to his car. I felt something settle inside me, not closure exactly, but acceptance. I had missed a moment, but I hadn't missed my son. And that distinction, I was learning, mattered. For a while after Daniel came by with that photograph, I allowed myself to breathe easier. I framed the picture and placed it on the mantel, right beside an old clock that ticked louder than it should. Every time I walked past it, I paused, just for a second, not to relive the pain, but to remind myself that I hadn't imagined our bond, that it had been real, that it still was. But peace, I learned, can be fragile when it's built on half-truths. The real unraveling didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It came quietly, the way most betrayals do, wrapped in politeness, softened by smiles, hidden behind the excuse of good intentions. It started with Thanksgiving. Daniel called in early November. "We're thinking of hosting this year," he said. "Emily's parents usually do it, but we want to try something different." My heart lifted. That sounds lovely. There was that pause again, the same one I had heard months earlier. "We're keeping it small," he added, "just immediate family." I waited. The silence stretched. "So, am I invited?" I asked, hating myself for the question the moment it left my mouth. "Of course," he said quickly, too quickly. "I mean, yes, I'll send you the details." When the message came later that week, it was from Emily. Her words were carefully chosen, each sentence polite enough to be unassailable. "Hi, Mrs. Harris. We're planning a very intimate Thanksgiving dinner. We'd love for you to stop by earlier in the day, maybe for dessert and coffee. We just want to keep the actual dinner very small and low stress." I read it twice, then a third time. Dessert and coffee. After the meal had been shared, after the table had been filled with laughter and past dishes and private jokes, after the togetherness. I stared at my phone, the room suddenly too quiet. The clock on the mantel ticked on, indifferent. I typed a response, deleted it, typed another. "That sounds nice. Thank you for thinking of me." I pressed send before I could change my mind. That afternoon, I baked a pie anyway. Apple, Daniel's favorite. I told myself it was foolish to expect otherwise, but some habits are hard to break. When I arrived at their house, the sun was already beginning to set. The windows glowed warmly from inside. Laughter spilled out when the door opened. Familiar now, that sound. It still made something in my chest ache. Emily greeted me with a smile and a quick hug that didn't linger. "Thank you for coming," she said, as if I were a guest who might not have. The table was already cleared, plates stacked in the sink. The smell of turkey and herbs hung in the air, like a memory I wasn't part of. Daniel hugged me longer. "Mom, I'm glad you're here." We sat in the living room. Coffee was poured, the pie was sliced and praised. Conversation stayed light. Weather, work, a show they'd been watching. Emily's parents had already left. I hadn't even known they were coming. At one point, Daniel mentioned a story from dinner, laughing as he told it. Emily joined in, finishing his sentence. They were comfortable, in sync. I smiled, nodding along. But inside, something hardened. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't anger exactly. It was the realization that I was being managed, carefully placed at the edges of their life, where I wouldn't interfere, but could still be pointed to as included. After that, the pattern became clearer. I found out about decisions after they were made, moves discussed once everything was settled, holidays planned with contingencies already in place for me, short visits, off hours, spaces that didn't overlap with others. And each time, Daniel would reassure me, "Emily just likes structure. It's not personal. We're trying to balance everyone." Balance. It's a delicate word. It can sound fair while still leaving someone standing alone. The truth revealed itself on a rainy Tuesday afternoon entirely by accident. Emily had asked if I could pick up a package for her. They wouldn't be home, she said, and it was important. I agreed, glad for the excuse to be useful. The box was heavier than I expected. I carried it inside, setting it carefully on the kitchen table. As I did, a smaller envelope slid out from underneath, landing at my feet. I bent to pick it up, intending to tuck it back where it belonged. My name was written on the front. Inside was a folded piece of paper. I shouldn't have opened it, I knew that, but curiosity, mixed with something sharper, pushed me forward. It was a seating chart.
Not for a dinner, for something larger. At the top, written in neat handwriting, anniversary party, final layout. I scanned the names quickly, my heart picking up speed, tables labeled, families grouped, and then I found myself, table 7, near the back, alone. No note, no +1, no placement beside my son. I sat down slowly, the paper trembling in my hands. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't oversight or poor timing or stress. This was intention. When Daniel and Emily returned home, I was still there. The seating chart lay folded neatly on the table between us. Emily noticed it first. "Oh," she said, her smile faltering just slightly. "You found that?" "I did," I replied, my voice calm in a way that surprised even me. Daniel looked confused. "What is that?" Emily inhaled, visibly bracing herself. "It's just a draft, nothing final." "Then why is my name already placed?" I asked. Silence filled the room, thick, uncomfortable. Daniel picked up the paper, scanning it, his brow furrowed. "Why is Mom sitting alone?" Emily's shoulders stiffened. "I didn't think it would be a big deal. It's just logistics." "Logistics," I repeated softly. She crossed her arms. "Look, I'm trying to make things work. Your mom is sensitive. She gets hurt easily. I didn't want tension." Daniel stared at her. "By excluding her?" She snapped, then immediately softened her tone. "I'm not excluding her. I'm just creating boundaries." That word again. Boundaries are meant to protect, not erase. I stood then, my legs steady, my heart strangely calm. I raised my son alone. I learned how to step back when needed. I know how to respect a life that isn't mine. But don't mistake my silence for smallness. Emily looked startled. Daniel looked torn. "I don't need to be centered, but I won't be hidden." Daniel set the paper down. "Emily, this isn't okay." She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time, she didn't have an answer ready. I gathered my coat. "I think I should go." "Mom," Daniel started. "I love you," I said, meeting his eyes. "That hasn't changed, but love doesn't mean I disappear so everyone else can be comfortable." At the door, I paused. "You get to choose what kind of man you want to be in your marriage. Just remember, you learned how to love by watching me." Outside, the rain was beginning to fall harder. I didn't rush to my car. I let it soak into my coat, my hair, my skin. For the first time, the pain wasn't sharp. It was clarifying. And I knew then that whatever came next, I would no longer be waiting quietly at the edges of my own life. I didn't hear from Daniel for 3 days after that. 3 days might not sound like much, but silence has a way of stretching itself thin, turning hours into questions and questions into memories. I didn't call him, not because I didn't want to, but because for the first time in my life, I understood that chasing reassurance only teaches people how easily you can be pushed aside. Those days were quiet, intentionally so. I woke early as usual and made my tea. The kettle whistled, the clock ticked, the house breathed the way it always had. But something inside me had shifted. I wasn't bracing anymore. I wasn't replaying conversations in my head, wondering what I should have said differently. I had said enough. On the 4th day, Daniel came. I heard his car before the knock. I stood at the sink watching his reflection move across the front window, my heart steady, my hands calm. When I opened the door, he looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, shoulders slightly slumped. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside. He didn't sit right away. He stood in the middle of the living room, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the space as if it might offer him answers. "We fought," he said finally. I nodded once. "I imagined you might." He let out a breath.
I didn't see it at first, not really. I kept telling myself it was stress, planning, that you'd understand. I usually do, I said gently. That's the problem, he replied, voice cracking. You always do. He sat down then, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. For a moment, he looked like the boy who used to sit that way after a bad day at school, waiting for me to say something that would make it better. But this time, I didn't rush. She told me she feels threatened, he said, not by you trying to interfere, by how much you mean to me. The words stung, even though I'd suspected as much. I never asked to compete, I said quietly. I know, and that's what I finally understood. You weren't asking for more, you were asking not to be erased. He looked up at me then, eyes wet. I'm sorry, Mom. I should have seen it sooner. Apologies don't fix everything, but they matter when they come with clarity. What are you going to do? I asked. He was quiet for a long time. I told her things have to change, he said at last, that you're not a problem to be managed. You're my mother. You're part of my life, not an accessory. My chest tightened, not with pain this time, but with something like relief. And what did she say? I asked. That she needs time, he answered honestly. She said she didn't realize how far she'd gone. I nodded. That at least was something. I'm not asking you to choose. I never would. I know, he said quickly, but I am choosing how I show up for both of you. After he left, I sat for a long while, letting the quiet settle around me. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt resolved. Weeks passed. The anniversary party was postponed. Emily didn't reach out. Daniel called more often. Sometimes we talked about small things, sometimes about hard ones. He didn't rush me into forgiveness, and I didn't demand explanations. Boundaries, I was learning, go both ways. Then one afternoon, Emily came with him. She stood awkwardly in my doorway, hands clasped, eyes uncertain. The woman who had once been so controlled now looked fragile. Thank you for seeing me, she said. I gestured for them to come in. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Daniel had once done homework, where I had counted bills and written notes and held my head in my hands when life felt too heavy. Emily spoke first. I owe you an apology, she said. Her voice trembled slightly. I thought if I could keep things organized, I could keep myself safe. I didn't realize I was hurting you. I studied her face, not for excuses, for sincerity. I was afraid I'd never be enough, that you'd always be the person he turned to first. Daniel reached for her hand. I inhaled slowly. Love isn't a ladder. There aren't rungs. There's room. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I see that now, or I'm trying to. I nodded. Trying is not nothing. We talked for a long time about expectations, about fear, about the difference between boundaries and walls. I didn't soften the truth, but I didn't sharpen it either. At one point, Emily looked at me and said, I don't want you to feel like an outsider in your son's life. I believed she meant it, or at least I believed she wanted to mean it. That was enough for now. Healing isn't a moment, it's a series of choices. The next family gathering was awkward, careful, but it was honest. I was invited for the whole thing. I sat at the table, I passed dishes, I laughed when it felt natural and stayed quiet when it didn't. No one pretended the past hadn't happened. Over time, something steadier took its place. Daniel stopped apologizing every time he called. Emily began asking my opinion, not on everything, but on enough. I learned how to be present without hovering. They learned how to include without feeling crowded. And me? I learned that being late to my son's wedding wasn't the deepest wound. Being quiet about how it made me feel, that was.
The sound of joy without me had shattered my heart, but it also woke me up. I didn't need to be at the center of every celebration to belong, but I deserved to be seen, to be acknowledged, to take up space without apology. One evening, months later, Daniel and Emily invited me over for dinner. Just dinner, no conditions. As we sat together, Emily raised her glass. "To family," she said. I met her eyes and nodded. "To family," I echoed. And for the first time since that day outside the wedding doors, the sound of joy didn't feel like something I was listening to from the other side. It felt like something I was part of again.
The first time I realized other people had noticed, it was at the grocery store. I was standing in the produce aisle, weighing apples in my hand the way I always did, testing for firmness, remembering how Daniel used to insist the shinier ones tasted better, when I heard my name spoken with a question mark at the end. "Margaret?" I turned to see Carol Whitman, an old family friend. Her son and Daniel had gone to school together for a few years before life scattered everyone in different directions. She looked at me with that familiar mix of curiosity and concern people reserve for women they haven't seen in a while. "I heard about the wedding," she said, lowering her voice. "You okay?" There it was, the quiet ripple I hadn't intended to make. "I'm all right," I replied honestly. She studied my face for a moment, then nodded. "You always are." That was when I understood people had seen more than I thought. The empty chair, the late arrival, the way I hovered at the edges of my own son's celebration. No one had said anything outright, but absence speaks a language of its own. Over the next few weeks, the whispers surfaced in small, careful ways. A cousin asked how married life was treating us all. A neighbor mentioned how hard it must have been to juggle everything that day. No accusations, no gossip, just acknowledgement. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. I had spent too many years translating my pain into something palatable for others. This time, I let the truth sit where it belonged. The real consequence, though, unfolded not in public spaces, but in private ones Daniel hadn't realized were watching him. Emily's parents came to town in early spring. They wanted to host a dinner, something casual, they said, to celebrate settling into married life. Daniel called me ahead of time. "They asked if you'd come," he said. There was a carefulness in his voice now, a sensitivity he hadn't needed before. "I told them you would." "I'd like that," I said. The dinner was held at a restaurant downtown, nothing fancy, white tablecloths, soft lighting, the kind of place that expects conversation more than ceremony. When I arrived, everyone stood, chairs were pulled out, smiles offered freely. Emily's mother took my hands. "We're so glad you're here," she said, and I believed her. The conversation flowed easily at first, travel, work, plans. Then, midway through the meal, Emily's father raised his glass. "I want to say something about family." The table quieted. "We're proud of these two," he continued, nodding toward Daniel and Emily, "but we're also proud of the families who shaped them. Margaret, you raised a good man." Daniel looked at me then, openly, no hesitation, no fear of disrupting anything. "I did," he said simply. Something shifted in the room, not dramatically, not loudly, but it shifted. After that night, things changed in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. I was introduced differently, not as Daniel's mom said quickly and moved past, but as the woman who raised him. Invitations came directly to me, not filtered through someone else's comfort. When plans were discussed, my availability was considered, not assumed. Emily, to her credit, did not retreat. She adjusted. One afternoon, she called me herself.
"I wanted to ask you something," she said, her voice tentative but sincere. "We're thinking of hosting a big anniversary party next year. Would you help me plan it?" I paused, letting the question settle. "Yes," I said, "I would." Not because I needed proof of change, but because I recognized effort when I saw it. Planning together was strange at first. We navigated each other carefully, learning rhythms we hadn't shared before. But as weeks went on, conversations softened. We talked about our childhoods, about fear, about the pressure of expectations we never asked for. One afternoon, while sorting through decorations, Emily said quietly, "I think I was afraid you'd see through me." "See through you to what?" I asked. "To someone who didn't know what she was doing," she admitted. I smiled gently. "That makes two of us." The anniversary party, when it came, was nothing like the wedding. It was imperfect, loud, full of overlapping conversations and children running between tables. There were no assigned seats, no rigid timelines. Daniel made a toast halfway through, unprompted. "I want to thank everyone for being here, and especially my mom. I wouldn't be standing here without her." Applause followed, not thunderous, but warm. I didn't cry. I didn't need to, because the real consequence of that late arrival wasn't humiliation or regret. It was reckoning. Daniel learned what silence costs, Emily learned what control erases, and I learned what happens when you stop shrinking to keep the peace. Later that night, as people gathered their coats and goodbyes lingered, a young woman approached me, a friend of Emily's, I think, newly married, nervous. "My mother-in-law didn't come to our wedding," she said, softly. "She said she didn't feel welcome." I looked at her, really looked. "Did you ask her why?" I said. She shook her head. "Ask," I told her gently, "before silence decides the story for you." She nodded, eyes shining, and walked away. I watched her go, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a lesson learned too late to be painless, but not too late to matter. The world didn't punish anyone for what happened at that wedding. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public shaming, but there were consequences all the same. They lived in changed behavior, in awareness, in the way Daniel now paused before assuming, in the way Emily checked herself before drawing lines that didn't need to exist, and in the way I now spoke, clearly, calmly, without apology. I had arrived late to my son's wedding, but I arrived fully in my own life, and that, I realized, carried its own quiet justice.
There is a strange kind of peace that comes when you stop arguing with the past. Not forgiveness exactly, at least not the kind that erases memory, but acceptance, the kind that allows the memory to stay where it belongs without letting it keep its grip on your throat. For a long time after the anniversary party, I noticed how often my mind drifted back to that wedding day. Not with the same sharp ache as before, but with curiosity, as if I were finally able to look at it from a distance and ask myself what it had really changed. The truth was uncomfortable, but it was honest. Being late to my son's wedding didn't break our relationship. What broke it, what cracked it open, was everything that had gone unsaid long before that day. I had spent years teaching Daniel to be kind, to be considerate, to notice others. But I had also taught him, without realizing it, that my feelings would always make room for everyone else's, that I would bend, that I would wait, that I would understand. And Emily, she hadn't created that dynamic, she had simply stepped into it. Once I saw that, truly saw it, something inside me softened, not toward the behavior, but toward the people, toward the complicated, imperfect humans we all were trying to love without a manual. Life moved forward, as it always does. Seasons changed, The garden I had neglected for years began to thrive again under my care. I planted new flowers, not worrying whether they were practical or impressive. I chose them because they made me smile. Daniel and Emily visited more often, sometimes together, sometimes Daniel alone. Our conversations grew less careful, more natural. We still disagreed at times about holidays, about politics, about the best way to raise future children, but the disagreements no longer carried fear. One afternoon, as we sat on the back porch watching the sun dip low, Daniel asked a question I hadn't expected. "Did you ever resent me?" he asked quietly. The honesty of it startled me. I thought for a moment before answering. "No," I said. "I resented the silence, not you." He nodded, absorbing that. "I think I thought being a good son meant not needing you, like independence was the same thing as distance." I smiled sadly. A lot of people confuse the two. He reached over and took my hand the same way he had as a child crossing busy streets. "I don't want to make that mistake again," he said. I squeezed his hand back. "Neither do I." Emily, too, found her way toward me, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. She asked questions now about Daniel's childhood, about what I had been like as a young mother, about the years before she knew us. One evening, as we cleaned up after dinner together, she hesitated by the sink. "I want to tell you something," she said. I dried my hands and turned toward her. "I used to think love was something you guarded, like if you didn't protect your place, someone else would take it. And now?" I asked gently. "And now I think love expands when you let it. But that idea still scares me." I nodded. Courage usually comes after fear, not before. She smiled faintly. "I'm trying." That was enough. The real test came the following spring. Emily announced she was pregnant. The news came in a phone call, her voice trembling with excitement and nerves all tangled together. I congratulated her warmly, meaning it with my whole heart. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time, letting the weight of what this meant settle in. A new generation, a new chance to do things differently. I didn't rush to insert myself. I waited. I let them lead. When Emily asked for help, I gave it. When she didn't, I respected that too. One afternoon, she invited me to the ultrasound appointment. "I want you there," she said simply. I didn't ask questions. I didn't assume motives. I just said yes. As I sat beside her in the dimmed room, listening to the steady rhythm of a tiny heart, tears streamed down my face without warning. Emily reached for my hand, squeezing it tightly. "I want our child to know you," she said softly. "Not from stories, from life." I looked at her then, really looked, and saw not the woman who once kept me at arm's length, but a mother-to-be standing on the edge of the same fear I had once known so well. "I will love them, in whatever way you let me." She nodded, eyes shining. "We want you in their life, fully." Later that night, alone in my bed, I thought again of the wedding, of the door closed between me and the joy inside. And I realized something that surprised me. If I could go back, if I could rewrite that day, I wouldn't erase the pain, because without it, none of this growth would have happened. Pain, when faced honestly, has a way of teaching lessons comfort never will. The baby was born on a rainy morning in October. Daniel called me before dawn, his voice thick with emotion. "She's here, Mom." I arrived at the hospital early, heart pounding with a familiar mix of nerves and love. When Emily placed that tiny bundle in my arms, something ancient and tender awakened inside me. I held my grandchild close, breathing in that new, indescribable scent. Life beginning again. Emily watched me carefully, then smiled. "She looks safe with you," she said. I swallowed hard. "I promise she will be." As months passed, I found my place, not by force, not by sacrifice alone, but by mutual choice. I babysat sometimes, I stayed over when asked, I stepped back when needed. I learned that presence doesn't require proximity every moment, just consistency, honesty, and respect. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, I would remember that sound. The laughter through the door, the applause I heard before I was seen. It no longer shattered my heart. Instead, it reminded me of the moment everything changed, the moment I stopped measuring my worth by how early I arrived or how visible I was in someone else's celebration. I had been late to my son's wedding, but I was not late to my life. I was not late to my voice, and I was not late to the understanding that love, real love, does not require your disappearance. It asks you to show up, truthfully, imperfectly, and fully. Somewhere, another mother might be standing outside a door right now, listening to joy she feels excluded from. If she could hear my voice, I would tell her this: you are not invisible just because someone forgot to look. You are not less important because you arrived late. And you do not lose your place in someone's life simply because the world moved forward for a moment without you. Sometimes the most important arrivals happen after the doors reopen. If you stayed with me this long, maybe it's because some part of this story felt familiar. Maybe you've been the one standing outside the door, listening to laughter, applause, life moving forward, wondering how you ended up on the outside of something you helped build. I used to believe that too. But here's what life taught me, gently and painfully all at once. Love should never require your disappearance. Being a mother doesn't mean shrinking. Being patient doesn't mean silent. And being late to a moment doesn't mean you were never important to it. Sometimes we confuse endurance with dignity. We think staying quiet is strength, but real strength, earned strength, is learning when to speak, when to stand, and when to let others see the cost of your kindness. If someone you love has hurt you by omission, not cruelty, if they didn't mean to wound you but still did, know this: your pain is still valid. Intent does not erase impact. And if you're the one who didn't notice someone missing until later, I hope you learned sooner than I did that love doesn't just live in big moments. It lives in awareness, in pauses, in making room. So I'll ask you, quietly, the way Auntie May always does, if you were standing outside that door, would you have walked in anyway? Or would you have kept convincing yourself that being unseen was the price of love? If this story touched something in you, share your thoughts in the comments. Someone else may need to read them. And if you believe stories like this matter, stories that tell the truth softly but honestly, then stay a while. Subscribe. Sit with me again. You're not late here. You're right on time.